our digital space, end online violence for a GBV-free Sri Lanka.
Global estimates show that 1 in 3 women experience physical or sexual violence in their lifetime, with TFGBV becoming an increasingly prevalent form. So we saw a bit of the statistics. Let's move on to some of the key questions. I'd like to move to Dr. Ramani. In Sri Lanka, we have the laws, the policies, the frameworks, the national action plans. However, laws are only as good as its implementation. Speak to us about the disconnect that we as citizens sometimes feel, Dr. Ramani, when accessing justice.
Thank you. I would like to qualify that laws are on their own really important and really good as well. Gaps in implementation come when there is a law. And when you look at something as complex and subtle as technology-facilitated gender-based violence, you need laws and then the policies that come with them to create an environment that this is an important, grave issue that the legislature thinks is important to have laws. Now, when we look at the laws, for years, we've looked at the Computer Crimes Act, very limited, and always use the penal code as having offences that can be interpreted to include technology-facilitated gender-based violence. Now, the limitations were that, one, we're looking at sexual and gender-based violence. Including sexual and gender-based violence, mainstreaming it in any conversation is difficult. So when you have generic laws, interpreting it and defining it to include, unless it's very clearly written in black and white, becomes difficult. Then came the Online Safety Act. When you look at the Online Safety Act from a gender lens, you realize that there are lots of ways the Online Safety Act can help victims of technology-facilitated gender-based violence. But this conversation is set within the extensive criticism about the Online Safety Act. Now, there is a lot being written about this. Is not the forum to say that, talk about it all, but primarily on the freedom of expression, how legislation can now control people's freedom of expression. Now, for us, when we talk about technology-facilitated gender-based violence, it's a question about where does the freedom of expression stop and the violence start. And it's very difficult because it can be very subjective. So in a situation where there's a huge conversation about this act, which we see about gender-based violence as enabling, looking at including, because the act doesn't say anything specific about gender-based violence, and looking at interpreting the act, using the act to address technology-facilitated gender-based violence becomes extremely difficult, because the bigger conversation out there is about curtailing the freedom of expression. So even with so-called enabling legislation, we are facing difficulties in getting recognition and access to justice for victims of technology-facilitated gender-based violence. Now, earlier I talked about an enabling environment. We have strong policies. Now, policies are not as strong as the laws, but we have the National Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment Policy, which recognizes and reiterates the commitments in the multi-sectoral action plan on addressing sexual and gender-based violence. We have other legislations like the Domestic Violence Act, which can be used in its definitions of violence to include TFGBV. But then what is the power of the Prevention of Domestic Violence Act in using as a deterrent or advocating for a position? Because it's a protection law. And then it gets narrow, it's in the domestic relationships, it's protection law. So it is in that complex background, we have these very strong policies. And now we have the Women Empowerment Act and setting up of the National Women's Commission. So in terms of policy and certain amount of laws, there is a strong law. And hopefully the access to justice for victims will improve with conversations like this. But still, and I'm sure someone else will speak about this, we are still faced with, especially women and girl victims, living in this context where there is stigma, shame, judgment making when you are a victim of technology-facilitated gender-based violence.